Second Chronicles 22, after you read a number of these kings, they almost start sounding alike. You're like, how many different versions of wickedness are we getting in chapter after chapter? And some kings are more wicked, some are less wicked, but you just get kind of tired of it. And so what we'll see today in Second Chronicles 22, a couple names that we uh, skipped in Second Kings, I'm sorry. So after today, Second Chronicles 22, we will go back to Second Kings 1, probably do about 9 chapters or so in Second Kings to catch up to where this is at. And what you'll see in Second Kings and the end of First Kings is God focuses our attention off of the political leaders and on to the religious leaders, primarily the prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And so there's a lot of good things happening while the wickedness is prevailing in politics, we would say. And so if we're recording this the day after an election, we don't expect our politicians to be religious leaders in any way. But we want them to allow us to worship with religious freedom. And if they do, then we'll praise God. If they don't, we will still keep praising God. Um, so what we're going to look at today is plays into the big picture of Scripture. And I brought a little illustration to help us remember this. But there's a few times in Old Testament history where God's promises to patriarchs or to kings comes close to becoming void. All right. So when God promises something, it almost doesn't happen because of certain things. So I wrote down three things in the Old Testament. This story is number 4. Okay. So the first one, the flood could have destroyed all of humanity because of the worldwide flood, right? And it almost sounds like that in Genesis 6, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And okay, if God destroyed all of humanity, which promise would have been voided? It would have been the Genesis 3:15, the promise that the seed of the woman was going to crush the head of the snake. So the second promise that God made to Abraham, that in Isaac, the Abrahamic covenant would be fulfilled, all the nations would be blessed. And then God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son. Oh. And then you think, how is God going to fulfill this promise if Isaac's dead? When it was in Isaac that his seed was going to be blessed and not Ishmael and not the other. And so it sounds like, well, Abraham, we are told in the New Testament, he thought God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. So if God's going to still fulfill his promise, but he's going to have to perform a resurrection. And then God stopped the sacrifice of Isaac. But that's another instance. And then the third instance, God promised through Jacob in Genesis 49. There's a couple promises to the tribes of Israel through Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, on his deathbed. Genesis 49, you can read those. And if God would have destroyed all of Israel whenever they made the golden calf, God says to Moses, I want to wipe them off and start again with you. If that would have happened, then the promise is made through Jacob about all of the lineage, including Judah, which was where the Messiah was going to come through, that would have been voided. And then, if you remember at the end, and that's in Exodus 32. There's probably also one or two other times as God is angry with Israel in the book of Numbers that he wants to wipe them out. Another time at Judges 21, when Benjamin doesn't turn over the wicked people that are like Sodom, the wicked men, and the Israelites start fighting against the Benjamites, and they almost eliminate that tribe. If that tribe would have been eliminated, then the promises made in Genesis 49 also wouldn't have been fulfilled. So this is at least the 4th time that a significant promise of God, and this promise is the Davidic covenant. Okay, in 2 Samuel 7, also I believe it's in First Chronicles, but 2 Samuel 7, God promises David that a descendant would come from him who would sit on his throne forever. So if David's line is wiped out, like Jeroboam's line is wiped out, Baasha's line is wiped out, and then eventually Ahab's line is going to be completely wiped out. If David's line gets wiped out, then God's promise to David 100 years previous to this would have been voided. Okay. And so I was trying to think of an illustration to help us to remember this. So God's promises are kind of like hardened steel. Okay. And if you try to get this lock off, and the best tool you have are ordinary scissors. Okay. You can try all you want to cut this. You're going to damage your scissors. There are bolt cutters, right? But if this is the best tool you have, and I wanted to try to find plastic scissors, because really, plastic scissors is the best Satan can do to try to cut the promises of God. Okay, but even if you had these, there's no way you're getting this off. Okay, so God's promises are more sure than hardened steel, and Satan's power is so weak compared to God's promises. But there comes times, and this isn't God wanting to destroy Israel or God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac or wanting to destroy the world in the flood. This is evil that is trying to, probably knowing God's promises, this is evil that is trying to eliminate David's line and therefore the Messiah. That's going to come hundreds of years after this. So you don't see that immediately in the text, but you have to remember David's line, the northern tribes of Israel, they have dynasties come and go. They last a couple generations. They come and go. When it comes to Judah, it has to be David's line. It has to be David's line because of God's promise to David. Jesus has to be a son of David to fulfill this promise. And so whenever there were, I think, blind men, they were crying out that Jesus would heal them. And I think it was in Jericho, and said, "Hey, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on us." They were connecting Jesus' messianic rule over creation and nature to his connection to David. So what we'll see is wickedness is too weak to cut the sovereign's promise. And it doesn't matter who's in leadership, whether they know God or don't know God. I really doubt Athaliah knew any of David's promises. She couldn't have cared less. She probably wanted one thing, power. And so she is ignorant of God and his ways and very knowledgeable in Baal and Baal worship and probably Ashtoreth and other false gods. So we see her coming, and there's not a lot of text about Athaliah. And so after this, we're going to go back to the prophets in First Kings. But for today, 2 Chronicles 22, there's only 12 verses here. And we'll see that a sovereign God temporarily allows his leader to blatantly reject him. This is so many times in the Kings that God allows his leader to reject him. Ahaziah is the youngest son of Joram or Jehoram. Jehoram blatantly rejected God. He dies with no one's regret. He dies an awful, painful death. We remember that in 2 Chronicles 21. Well, his son becomes king. Verse 1 of 2 Chronicles 22, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place, for the band of men that came with the Arabians, which we read about in chapter 21, to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, reigned, and Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. So if his dad is 40 and he becomes king at 22, now there's a Hebrew discrepancy that it could be 42, and it's impossible for him to be older than his dad. So he 22 it was probably a scribal error. But even at 22, being the youngest son, he's got several older brothers. He had to have been born when his dad was how old? If his dad's 40 and he's 22.
18.
18. So his dad is 18 when he's born, and he's the youngest. So his dad is having children as king, but he's the son of his dad is the son of Jehoshaphat. His dad is married to Athaliah, and so Athaliah is this guy's mom, and uh, that's how often kings had children. Okay, Solomon, same way. He's a probably teenage dad. That it's odd to us to think that way, but it's very normal in the line of kings that they were having children in their teens. Okay. And so I just point that out because he's going to have all of his children eliminated except one. And at 22, he's got a number of children already. Okay. And so only he is the youngest of his dad's children, and the youngest, I believe, of his line is spared at the end of our story. All right, so Ahaziah, verse 2, is 22 years old, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. When you see a 22-year-old ruling for 1 year, you know things are not going well. His dad, things didn't go well for him, only serving 8 years, very cruel. And his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. And he also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab. So, in connecting him to Omri, Omri was the worst of all the kings of Israel. Then Ahab come, and he was worse than his dad. And his mother, this guy's mother, Ahaziah's mother, is Athaliah, daughter of Ahab. And look at verse 3. For his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. And so Jezebel's counseling Ahab to do wickedly. They have a daughter, Athaliah, marries into the southern kingdom. Jehoram listens to her and is extremely cruel and wicked. And then his youngest son, Ahaziah, becomes king for a year. And in that year, he is known for doing wickedly because he's listening to his wicked mother. Verse 4, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and as the house of Ahab had done. So there's very little distinguishing between the north and the south. Now they both look alike in following Baal. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing. Verse 5, he even followed their counsel and went with Jehoram. So his counselors, after the death of his father, same counselors likely as his father, because his father only served for 8 years. As a younger king, he needs counsel. He's listening to his really wicked mom. He's listening to wicked counsel around him. And he followed their counsel, verse 5, and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, because there are still that marriage alliance. He went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, king of Syria. So I mentioned these two. The house of Ahab is still ruling in the north, and Hazael is now king of Syria. Hazael is, remember, one of those men who was chosen by God to bring judgment on the house of Ahab and on the house of Judah. So it's like, okay, so the sovereign God temporarily allows his leader to blatantly reject him. What do we see? He's listening to wicked counsel, opposite of Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who doesn't listen to the counsel of the ungodly. Here are kings who are listening to the counsel of the ungodly, and it's to their undoing. Okay. He also allies with a wicked kingdom, which has been Jehoshaphat's problem, and now likely Jehoram, and now third generation of allying with the wicked kingdom of Israel. and they're fighting against Hazael, who is a servant of God to eliminate the wickedness in Israel. So a sovereign God clearly controls judgment. And so this judgment, they're fighting against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. That's the place where Ahab dies years ago. Syrians wounded Joram, that's the king of Israel in the north, and he returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that he had received at Ramah when he had fought against Hazael, king of Syria. So twice were mentioned this Hazael, king of Syria. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah. Okay, so cousin to or nephew to the king, because his mom is a brother to Jehoram, king of Israel in the north. He goes and down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was wounded. So he cares about his uncle, and they have this alliance in battle. They also he hears about his uncle getting wounded, and he goes to visit him. Now we have God and the Lord mentioned a couple times here as God's orchestrating this. And so this is why we get sovereignty. It was, verse 7, but it was ordained by God that the downfall of Ahaziah should come about through his going to visit Joram. For when he came there, he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu, the son of Nimshi. Now, Jehu is the second guy. So there was Elisha, Hazael, and Jehu, all that in 1 Kings 19, that God told Elijah, there are still 7,000 people that haven't bowed the knee to Baal, and you're not alone in fighting against wickedness. I'm going to have you anoint 3 people. He actually doesn't anoint the other 2, and Elisha is responsible after Elijah is taken to heaven to anoint the next 2 or to find someone to anoint them. So Hazael, king of Syria, Jehu, going to be the king of Israel, and Elisha is the prophet. So you'll see those 3 names in 1 Kings 19, 15, and 16. And so 2 of them are mentioned here. Hazael, they're fighting against in Syria. And as they get, the king of the north gets wounded, um, God allows this ungodly alliance to cause compassion in the south to go to the north. And while he's visiting is when Jehu has been ordained by the prophet, and we'll see him in 2 Kings. And it's at this very visit when Jehu's got the kingdom because of his anointing, and he's going to execute judgment. So it's almost like whenever there's wickedness is kind of like a conveyor belt, and God ordains people on either side to like, okay, get rid of the wicked. And Hazael wounded Joram, king of Syria, but Jehu's gonna wipe him out. Also on this conveyor belt of wickedness that has to be eliminated is Ahaziah, king in the south. And while he's visiting his wicked uncle, Jehu is also used to eliminate him. So God's judgment comes, eliminated wickedness, and it doesn't last long. I mean, his dad's serving for 8 years, he's serving for 1 year. And the people of Israel are thankful that these kings are serving very short amount of time. Even his mom's only going to serve 6 years. Okay, so it's a blessing. It's a relief to the people of Judah that these extremely wicked, ungodly kings aren't ruling long. So God oversees that the ungodly choices and alliances lead to judgment. And God oversees that the godly heritage leads to some honor. Okay, so let's read. As Jehu gets the kingdom, he is tasked to eliminate Ahab and Ahab's family. Okay, and verse 8, and it says at the end of verse 7 that he was whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. So Jehu was the one promised in Elijah years ago to be anointed to take out completely eliminate the house of Ahab. And when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he met the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them. Okay. I'm not sure he had to, but he's just in this, I gotta eliminate kings mode. And so everyone who's a king is like, oh, Israel, Judah, I'm going to take you out. Okay. Um, and then verse 8 continues. So he killed all of those who attended Ahaziah. That's the king in the south, Judah. He searched for Ahaziah and he captured them while he was hiding in Samaria. So king in the south, Ahaziah, goes to visit king in the north in Samaria, and king in the north is dead. Now Ahaziah is going to die as well. And he was brought to Jehu and put to death, and they buried him. And now Jehu has some leanings toward godliness. He's not a godly king in the north, but he is um, leanings away from Baal worship, at least. They buried him, for they said he is the grandson of Jehoshaphat. So the honor that is shown Jehoshaphat by how they treat his grandson is remarkable. And why did they honor this king who was ungodly? Because he was related to Jehoshaphat. Why did they still honor Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart? Okay. And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. So Ahaziah is only 22. He doesn't have old enough sons to rule the kingdom. He may have some really young sons. We know he has a 1-year-old, but he may have others, but they're not old enough to be king because he's only 22. Verse 10. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. So everybody that was related to David that she could find in the house of Judah, um, all of, and now if you remember back in chapter 21, that the Arabians killed all and left just the youngest Ahaziah. Jehoram, who was wicked before Ahaziah, he killed all of his brothers. So there's been a massive killing of a lot of the line of David previous to this. But when Athaliah becomes queen, she does the rest. Okay, she is searching. She wants no one alive that can be legitimately take over the kingdom. She wants to be the ruler. Okay, and she's probably killing her grandchildren to do so. So all the men are going to be in this royal family are going to be destroyed. But okay, if we just left with verse 10, she destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah. If we stopped at verse 10, the Davidic covenant is destroyed. It's void. God promised something that he couldn't bring it to about to be. That is never going to be the case. God's resources are unlimited. You can try your best to go against him, but you can look at the Old Testament when the priests of Pharaoh tried to imitate the plagues, and eventually they couldn't, and they said, "This is the finger of God." All right, we can't. They could never stop the plagues. They could only add to them only a few times. Uh, and we'll see this throughout human history. Man and his wickedness, the best he can do is try to cut try to cut the promises of God, the plan of God, and this is his strongest weapon, and it doesn't even scratch it. Okay. This is hardened steel, and this this is not. Okay. So that's the best the wickedness can do. Wickedness is too weak to cut the sovereign's promise. Okay. Wicked counselors rule just how they counsel. There's a note here that demons and Satan are influencing this extremely ungodly king, one of the wickedest queens, like Jezebel, her daughter, likely, to eliminate all the offspring of David. Does she know the Davidic covenant? Probably not. But she doesn't want any rivals. Therefore, if she can eliminate all the offspring of David, she will void God's promise to David. But those wicked scissors are too weak to cut the divine thread of God's promise. Athaliah is so similar to King Herod at the time of Jesus' death. But look at how weak Herod the Great was. And after he tried to do that, then he died. So that's verse 10, and we're glad that the scripture doesn't end with verse 10. And verse 11 starts with the word, but Jehoshabeath, the daughter of the king, that's the daughter of Jehoram, and this is the sister to Ahaziah, who was ruling for a year. She takes Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were about to be put to death, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus Jehoshabeath, the daughter of King Joram, and the wife of Jehoiada the priest. So she is married to a priest, and Jehoiada is going to be influential in helping a little Joash to rule. Because she was a sister of Ahaziah, she hid him from Athaliah so that she did not put him to death. And he remained with them 6 years. So there is a godly person to protect David's line. Here's a 1-year-old. He can't barely walk. He cannot protect himself from the weakest soldier with a sword. Okay. And yet God used a lady, his aunt, to protect him, and a priest. And notice where they hide. Verse 12, and he remained with them 6 years, hidden in the house of God, while Athaliah reigned over the land. Why in the house of God? Does Athaliah have any use for the temple? Absolutely not. This is a forsaken building for 6 years. Likely Jehoram, Athaliah's husband, 8 years, extremely wicked. He is like the kings of Israel. So he likely, after Jehoshaphat dies, they don't go into the temple then. 8 years, then a year of Ahaziah, another year of wickedness. No need for the temple. Athaliah, 6 more years. So you add that up, about 15 years where the temple is just completely shut up. They don't need it. And that's a perfect hiding place for a godly king who's a year old, and he's going to be youngest king ever in Israel's history. So God uses a godly place to protect David's line. So in this chapter, it seems really, really dark. I mean, you've gone from bad to worse, from a king was judged by God 8 years, and the way he died was gruesome, and no one even missed him. And then his son becomes king, and he's listened to his wicked, evil mom, and both of them so evil. And God eliminates the one. We're going to see that he's going to eliminate Athaliah, but Athaliah nearly destroys the Davidic covenant. But she is the best that Satan can do. And she's like those scissors and cannot cut hardened steel. God's glory shines in the darkest political hours. When the worst kings and queens reign, we can take comfort that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he will come again one day, soon, to eliminate all leaders who reject him as Lord. You can read Psalm 2, and the nations of the earth are going to hate the fact that Jesus is King. We can rejoice that powerful wicked leaders cannot change God's promises or stop his plans. God's resources are unlimited, and his control is perfect.